Hello everyone and welcome to my show. My name is Merlin Fulcher. This evening it is the 22nd of April. I'd like to say thanks to everyone because I've been doing this for 7 days now. This is my 7th programme and it's been really fun. I've learned loads. Thanks to all the engagement and responses, I've had 9 subscribers, 93 views and 3.9 hours of these videos have been watched. And I think really that's possibly more than I would have had in terms of my conversations if I'd just been sat at home. I wouldn't have really reached as many people in this lockdown scenario. So it's been great. If this keeps on growing at this rate exponentially, I'll have quite a successful YouTube channel. But anyway, the success is just having these fun conversations. And obviously I've covered a lot of topics in this program. I think the big news today, it sort of came out of some press conferences, and effectively it was saying that it's likely that social distancing will continue for the rest of the year. And that's from the chief medical officer saying that really we need a highly effective vaccine or a highly effective drugs program that will respond to the what it feels like to have this disease. And until we have that, and we're not likely to have that for 12 months, then we can't really lift this social distancing. Now, obviously, social distancing is different from lockdown, but social distancing does change the way we behave. And as we've discussed before on this show, social distancing and the kind of way we live in a social distancing scenario puts extra pressures on where we are, what we expect from where we are, and what we expect from home, but also the kind of amenities in the local area. And these are all things that I think are really fascinating to reflect on, especially since it's the lockdown itself only really came into place in the UK after the public were already locking down in a way. So in the 2 weeks before the Prime Minister said work from home, pubs will be closed, people were already starting to work from home, people were already going to pubs less. And in some ways, there is something to suggest that the government policy actually responded to public opinion, and public opinion as it was reflected in the media, which was effectively saying this is how we have to respond to this crisis in the same way that other European countries are responding. So I would argue that the public is very much in control of the lockdown itself, and this is a kind of concept controlled by us really, rather than the government. And it was fascinating because in press conferences back in early March, we were hearing the sort of line that you can't impose a lockdown now because people will get fatigue and they'll give up and they'll kind of move beyond it. Now we're 5 weeks into it, and I follow the news quite closely. I'm not really seeing anything suggesting that people are having a fatigue or that people are becoming more lax in their approach to lockdown. If anything, now that we've passed this kind of crucial 40-day acclimatization, people are actually getting in their stride. They've worked out a way to make it work for them. And there's been some really interesting surveys that have come out. So one of them was by YouGov earlier this week, and it found that only 9% of people in Britain say that they would like things to go back to how they were before the lockdown. Now, obviously, that's everybody would much rather people weren't dying and in hospital. Now that's pretty clear. But in terms of the impact that it's had on their lives beyond this, people are saying stuff like they can hear the birds sing, they're connecting more with their family, friends and neighbours, they feel like the air is cleaner, they feel like there's actually in some ways more meaning in their life. And so only 9% of them think things were better before. Now that's an extraordinary thing to think of, especially since coming out of this lockdown, it's going to be public opinion that basically gives the government the mandate to lift the lockdown. Now, I wanted to talk about a survey, another YouGov survey, and this was commissioned by Newsnight, one of my favourite television programmes, and it was on the show last night, but they really only talked about it just a tiny bit towards the end. So I thought I'd go and have a little bit more detailed look at this this chart. So this is fascinating. So effectively what they've done is they've asked people in Britain what would they feel comfortable doing once these things reopen, and what would they feel uncomfortable doing. And I think to start at the bottom, so you can see that 62% of people would feel uncomfortable going to a gym. and 30% would feel comfortable. And then beauty and nail salons, most people are uncomfortable doing that. Pubs and bars, most people are uncomfortable. Coffee shops, restaurants. Now, when you get to clothing stores, it's a bit more split. So if we can imagine coming out of the lockdown, hopefully this will be something that's happening through late May, June. So people are thinking, yeah, I think I could go to whatever, the TK Maxx, Primark. I think I could manage that because I've been in these big supermarkets and I've seen how they've managed crowds. Hairdressers and barbers. Now, I mean, obviously, it shows that people want to look good. They want to have their hair done. They want to have nice clothes. Generally, hairdressers and barbers are very clean environments, and also they're not too crowded. And then garden centres, and I think this garden centres one's quite telling because it sort of reflects our mentality now, which is that obviously if you're lucky enough to have a garden, you're probably thinking, you're doing some gardening, you think this is reasonably harmless, kind of solo pursuit that you can do, you're outdoors, you're enjoying the kind of lockdown dividend, that clean air and the sound of the birds singing. So yeah, effectively, I think this is really telling because for me it doesn't just say how we are now, but it kind of talks of an emerging consensus around public space and how public space will go forward. Now, this is an image from an article which featured on a Daily Mail piece. I think this was on the 19th of March, and this is about a day before the UK government effectively said pubs have to close. But at the start of this week, the Prime Minister had already said, I would advise you not to go to pubs. And this is a pub in Tooting where I live. This is called JJ Moon's, and it's Wetherspoons pub. And it's a pretty reasonable pub. It's a very popular pub, and I think it's got a lot of locals in it. I can probably recognise some of the people that I've seen wandering around the streets of Tooting. And I would say that if you said pubs can reopen, of course in this survey some people say they won't go to a pub, but plenty of people will go to a pub. And there will be, for the most part, pubs like this are mostly safe. And if anything, they can be very clean. And if anything, this will probably put a bit more pressure on bar managers to make sure the toilets are clean and there's soap and all that kind of stuff. So we could see pubs improving generally. I think this particular one could certainly have some improvements. I mean, here's a picture of me just before the lockdown came in. So I think this is on the 9th of March. I'm in a pub called the Sir John Oldcastle, which is in Farringdon. And I think I took this picture of myself and I sent it to some friends in Milan who were under lockdown to say, I'm having a pint in solidarity with the fact that you can't right now, but I'm enjoying this small bit of freedom in recognition of the sort of sacrifices you were making. Obviously, there was a kind of inkling in my mind that the situation wouldn't go on. This pub was very empty. I think it was a Thursday evening, and I was waiting for a train home. I think this pub's possibly a lot bigger than the Wetherspoons in Tooting, and it has sort of cleaner facilities and things like that. So I think that we'll see public spaces respond and change and adapt. And I think gyms, for example, I think I would probably definitely go to the gym, but obviously I will continue to be careful about washing my hands. But then in the same way, I'd expect the gym to be as clean as possible, and if it wasn't, I probably would feed that back to the staff there in ways that I probably wouldn't before, because I wouldn't want to be fussy. But I think now I'd see it more as a kind of civic duty rather than just me being a difficult customer. But I think just looking back at this slide, what's absent from this slide just doesn't mention going back to the office. So obviously, in many ways, it's a privilege to be lucky enough to work from home during this crisis. If you're an office worker, many of us are working from home, and other people sadly have had to go out and put themselves at risk, some more, some less. Now, this chart doesn't mention it, and anecdotally, I'm often hearing people say, well, look, after this lockdown, I'm not sure if I really do want to go back to the office. Firstly, I've had a pay cut, so I can't afford the extremely expensive public transport costs to come into the office. Thirdly, there's all kinds of other things that you're having to deal with, potentially still looking after the kids and other stuff. It's just many people have realised that working from home is pretty good, and they've started to realise that actually they live in a neighbourhood where there's a really great park near their house, and there's some great shops, and actually that's slightly better than their office, which doesn't have a really nice park next to them. So I think you can't put it back in the bottle. People have had these experiences. We've moved forward in the way that we we inhabit a city and what we expect, what we know is possible in terms of our employment. We know we can do those things from home. So this chart doesn't mention it. It's interesting. I'm surprised that Newsnight didn't ask YouGov to put it in. Now here's a picture of me in one of the offices that I work in, and it's a lovely place. I think that I would go back to this office. I really enjoy being there and spending time with people. And I would also go back to the other offices that I spend time and enjoy being in. But I also continue to work from home, and I've worked from home for about 5 years, and I've really enjoyed that. But I've really enjoyed a balance. I've really enjoyed being able to take my laptop out to cafes, go to the Tate Modern, other places, and I'll continue to do that as well. But I will be very, very careful about it. Anyway, I think all this stuff's really interesting because it does have a really big bearing on our built environment, and particularly property investment. Because I think when it comes to property investment and it comes to residential property and the kind of products that are produced, they often try to gloss over location, and they kind of present a branding and a luxury residential experience. But often where these things are, they're not necessarily in places that are particularly good to be in a lockdown scenario, and neither are they necessarily products, i.e. residential spaces, that are particularly good compared to other options when you're in this situation. Now certainly if you look at something like, this is a slide that shows the Nine Elms residential zone, there are one bedroom apartments here for 1.5 million. There are in other parts of London for that extraordinary amount you could get a house with a garden. So I think somewhat the experience from this might be that people would rather have a garden. Now the reason that I'm discussing this is because there was a survey published, which is the New London Architecture High Rise Survey. It's an annual survey. It's really good. It's worth reading. Now it said some pretty interesting stuff. So what happened in 2019, there were 60 buildings completed that were over 19 stories in London. 19 stories is like the height of a 1960s council tower block. So there were 60 buildings in London built that were taller than that last year. That's a lot. London's a big city, but I mean 60 skyscrapers is a lot. And in many ways that some of them are clustered in certain places. For example, Nine Elms, which we can see in this slide. Somewhere in East London around the Olympic Park, or Canary Wharf, for example. The Isle of Dogs is a real high-rise cluster, the City of London. There's some in suburban areas, Croydon, Wembley. And in many ways, this is a sign of the kind of economic health of a city, and we need more houses. We know that, and construction projects like this create a lot of economic activity. They create a lot of jobs. Now, looking at this survey, it says that in 2020, this is before the crisis, they expected 29 completions of similar height buildings. So they're already expecting it to go from 60 to 29. And that possibly reflects some of the kind of drag on expensive housing in London that was caused by the referendum in 2016, the EU referendum. But it does say some really interesting stuff. So it says that in the pipeline, in terms of what's on the drawing boards in architects' offices and planning departments and stuff, there are 525 more buildings like this which are proposed for London. And 89% of those tall buildings, of those 525, are residential. So if we think sort of before the coronavirus crisis, effectively it meant that there was about 500 residential towers planned. Now in the current situation, residential towers tend to be prestige products. They don't tend to be affordable housing, although there are some very good examples of high-rise affordable homes, but typically the affordable homes are lower down, and at the top are the most expensive units, and the idea is that up there you have this kind of prestigious view of the city. Now I would argue, I think that you can operate a skyscraper in a way that is socially distancing compliant. I think, for example, you could have an etiquette around the lifts. You could have people cleaning the lifts frequently to make sure they're really clean. I think in some ways paying a lot to have a view of the city, and that to be a city that you cannot enjoy, in the same way that you might have done in the past. To be able to see those sort of twinkling lights, but rather than seeing the kind of bars and theatres and nightlife of West London or wherever, you're seeing a kind of empty zone. I think that that's a bit weird, and I think in some ways some of the sort of the magic of the proposition of having your own slice of London, I think that is slightly diminished. Certainly in the present situation. Hopefully that doesn't necessarily. There is a kind of bounce back, and there is economic activity, and that kind of glamour and excitement of owning a high rise space in the city continues. But I would say really, I don't think that's necessarily enough to make people see it in the same way. I think that kind of the fundamentals of the high rise and the super expensive high rise residential has changed. I mean, what do I know? I'm never going to be able to afford to buy one anyway. But those are just my reflections. I would say one thing while we're discussing Nine Elms. I think Nine Elms, they always sell it on the view, but originally in the earlier master plans for the area, there was intended to be a linear park, and that's this pink line that goes through, and it was supposed to connect Battersea Park to the left, and then Vauxhall Spring Gardens to the right, which is just off the map. And one of the sort of criticisms of Nine Elms, which is this area of extraordinary architectural talent, has gone into it, but some of the results, it's basically a kind of motorway with high-rise residential next to it. It's not quite reached its point of being a lively town centre, but that could still happen. Now, I think this linear park, I think is one of the many criticisms of the area, is that the linear park was squeezed, and the linear park became a kind of pedestrian path with some planters, and it could have been something really epic and really stunning. And I think that if the linear park was the defining characteristic of Nine Elms, no doubt, if anyone just said Nine Elms, say, oh yeah, the linear park, then I think that actually would strengthen the kind of proposition that you'd have in a place like this, in our kind of post-lockdown scenario, because people would say, well, yeah, I'm living there, but there's a stunning linear park. I can walk along this beautiful pedestrian route to Battersea Park, which is, again, a really lovely place, and I can have a really healthy, socially distancing, compliant lifestyle. Now, I think one thing is that about our present economic settlement is it's enormously adaptable. So I think that people will adapt, property development will adapt, and we'll see things changing, and we'll see more and more of these things being factored in. But I also think London is also a city with a lot of population. It will continue to have a big population. There will continue to be a demand, and we might have to rethink the economics behind big towers. But I think we'll probably still need towers. Hopefully those towers will be towers which are more affordable to everybody, their economics are rethought, and also a better place to live during a crisis like this, or a lockdown if they ever happen again. So just a few reflections on some interesting surveys that have come out, and I think that these things are really important because it is public opinion, which is the driving force behind the lockdown, and it will be public opinion that brings us out of this lockdown. So what people want now will be decisive, and I think it's really fascinating the more and more we think about it. Thanks for listening. Do subscribe if you've enjoyed this, and I will keep on making cool, interesting videos. Comment, share your thoughts. Thank you. Good night.